All right, it's time to get started here tonight, and we are going to be starting a brand new series tonight, and I'll explain more about that in just a minute. We'll give people a chance to kind of trickle in here. This may be all the trickling we get tonight. We've still got TJ's out of town. We've got some others out of town. I think Miss Vicky's slipping in here. All right, so before we even get started, I lost my pants. So, but I have on a pair of pants. It's just not the pants that go with this suit. So I don't know. I don't have an explanation except when I pulled the suit out of the closet this afternoon, I know there was a pair of pants on the hanger because I checked it out. But when I got here and to change from my club kids attire, because for those of you tuning in by broadcast, we have clubs in the afternoons up until 6 o'clock where we run around and chase after kids, so I don't have a suit on for that. And then I change into my suit for Wednesday night. Well, when I went and grabbed the suit off the hanger, guess what? There was no pants on the hanger. So standing there in the changing room with no pants on, I opted for the black jeans versus asking Jason to make sure it was only focused from the waist up, okay? So, now the funny thing is, this is Northwest Colorado. If I had never said anything, this would be totally acceptable in most churches. In fact, I've known several pastors around here that preach all the time with their blue jeans on and a jacket. This just isn't me, and so I'm saying this mostly for our people who are looking at me going, Pastor, did you really, working nights has really got your brain screwed up there or something. So anyway, so I don't know what happened to the pants. Hopefully they're not laying out in the driveway at the house. I'd be happier to get home and find out they fell off the hanger in the bedroom or something. But anyway, having said that, how do you like that for an introduction? So tonight we are starting on a brand new series. I'm going to have a word of prayer and then I will explain to you what we're doing. I don't have a lesson handout tonight, because tonight we're just going to kind of break ground on this a little bit. Starting next week, I'll have some lesson handouts for you. I think I've never taught this series before. This is totally new for me, but it is probably one of the most requested things that I've had people ask about. And I've even had several people say, you need to write a book on this. In fact, I've had a lot of my independent fundamental Baptist brethren who do not understand this movement have asked me several times, you need to at least write a pamphlet or something on it. It is something I've done a lot of research on. Now, that's good. The bad news is I've never taught on this, so sometimes this may go a lot of different directions. In other words, I've never funneled down and refined this into what I would call a 4-star presentation. So you may kind of get the rough end of it, so to speak, and it may be something I write a book on someday. I don't know, because quite honestly, nobody has really addressed what I call the hyper grace movement, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. So let's pray. Lord, thank you once again for your goodness to us, and Father, I pray that you'd bless our time tonight. Pray that you'd be with me, and I pray that you would help my thoughts to be concise and to express the things I need to express. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so hyper grace. Probably the first question is, what is it? Second of all, where did it come from? Now, when we say a religion versus a movement, let's talk about what that is for just a minute. A religion would be an established religious group, denomination, etc., such as Baptist, Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, so on and so forth. A movement is not exactly a religion, because movements can transcend denominations. In other words, you could have this movement within several denominations. For instance, Reformed theology technically is more of a movement, okay? However, it finds itself mostly in religions such as Presbyterianism, and then anything that's called a Reformed church. Now, this is where it becomes kind of a movement, because we have Reformed Baptist churches. They are Baptists, but they hold to the doctrines of the covenant theology, or the doctrines of the Reformed movement. So I know that can be a little confusing at times. And so as we look at this thing of hyper grace, I want you to understand this is not a religion. If anything, this is more of a movement. And it finds itself mainly today in Bible churches, Baptist churches, and some non-denominational churches. Okay? It is not Reformed theology. In fact, to the hyper grace crowd, they would be quick to tell you, we are definitely not Reformed theology. We are not covenant theology. We are not Calvinists. They're very adamant about that. Unfortunately, here's what's the strange thing about the hyper grace movement. The hyper grace movement, because of the way it plays out, on the surface it looks a little bit like Calvinism. But they'll be adamant to tell you they are not Calvinists, okay? So, hyper grace. It's difficult to tell you in one sentence even exactly what hyper grace is. Hyper grace is taking grace, which we believe in, and it comes really out of the grace movement. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. It comes out of the grace movement, but it kind of goes beyond the norms of the grace movement. And in fact, that's what hyper is. When we say hyper-Calvinism, hyper-Calvinism is like an extreme part of Calvinism. What some of us would consider normal Calvinism, this goes to an extreme. Grace, hyper grace does the same thing. The basic tenets of the grace movement we would agree with, probably 95 to 100%, okay? But I take exception with hyper grace, okay? Hyper grace has some problems, some serious problems. And so I guess I could give you some characteristics of a hyper grace church, which was this church when I first came here. When I first came here, this church was a hyper grace church. They were more of a hyper grace Bible church. They just had Baptist out on the name, that's all, out on the sign, okay? They weren't Baptists. They were not centrists in their doctrine. They were really kind of an extreme. Now, we did have a spattering of different things. We actually had a few old style, what I call old-fashioned, middle-of-the-road, independent fundamental Baptists. We still had a few of those in here. We even had a few that I would have classified as MacArthur Lordship Salvation, which is the opposite of hyper grace. And then we had some that would have been a little more grace, but not hyper grace. So this church was really kind of a weird mixture, which is also why they fought all the time. They weren't in agreement on what they believed at all, and there were a lot of factions kind of pulling this church, trying to pull this church a lot of different ways. So that's kind of when I first came here. So when I first came here, I got introduced to some concepts I'd never heard of before. For instance, they were upset that I had an invitation. But not everybody was upset I had an invitation at the end of the preaching service. But after I'd been here for a couple of months, the majority all of a sudden, the supposed majority, were upset that I was having an invitation. And this is typical of hyper grace. Hyper grace, they are so adamant about not adding works to salvation that what they do is they gut the gospel. All right? Now, I know this. I'm throwing out some things here. Once again, I told you, you're getting the raw edition here. I've got a lot of different things and different directions I could go. So some of these, if you're like, I don't fully understand what you're saying, before we're done, I think you will understand, okay? They were opposed to an invitation. They were opposed to a sinner's prayer and salvation. They didn't believe in gospel tracts. They didn't believe in repentance as a part of salvation. They did not believe in contrition over sin when a person gets saved. They didn't even really believe in being under conviction of the Holy Spirit when a person gets saved. They had told me, there were several of the churches that told me I needed to preach out of the Gospel of John if I was going to preach on salvation, because that's the only place we find the true gospel is in the Gospel of John. That's called the Johannine Gospel, by the way. They were adamant, they were like hyper on steroids about this thing over the judgment seat of Christ. We're all going to stand to be judged one day. And if you don't shape up when you get to heaven or you get to the kingdom, at best, you're going to be living on Skid Row. You know, I mean, you know, they were, it was insane. And so when I first came here, I can remember going home many a night to my wife saying, I don't understand what's going on. I've been a Baptist my whole life, and I have never seen what's going on in this church. It was insane. It was insanity to me. So being the person that I am, boots on the ground, I got busy and started studying real fast. And I started picking up on things they were saying, and I'd start Googling it. And then I'd pick up on certain people they'd mention. And so I would Google that. Who are they? What did they write? And I'd start reading. I was reading volumes of information. Because I'm the kind of person that I want to know what's going on. I want to be up to speed, okay? If I'm going to do anything, I'm going to study it so that I know it, okay? And especially if it's somebody that is somewhat opposing me. I want to know all about them. That's the way I am, okay? And I like to study all different sides of an issue. So I have spent a lot of time studying this and coming to grips with it. So what is hyper grace? Hyper grace takes the doctrine of grace and it pushes it to an extreme to the point where it becomes doctrinal error. Okay? That would be the most concise definition that I could give you. Hyper grace takes the doctrine of grace, which we believe in, and it pushes it to an extreme to the point of it becoming doctrinal error. So where did this movement come from? Well, in a nutshell, it came mostly from one man by the name of Zane Hodges. Zane Hodges was a seminary professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. Now, the interesting part is the grace movement came out of Dallas Theological Seminary. We wouldn't have a problem with the grace movement for the most part, which was in reaction to the Lordship Salvation crowd associated with John MacArthur. And what John MacArthur said in Lordship Salvation, I actually believe, did begin to add works to salvation. Dr. Ryrie wrote the main response to that out of Dallas Theological Seminary, and it was in response to John MacArthur. He wrote several responses to John MacArthur. They had this little, this little battle going on back and forth. John MacArthur would say something, Charles Ryrie would write a response to it. Out of that was kind of spawned what we call the grace movement or the free grace movement. We kind of went grace, free grace, and then to hyper grace. And really the person that pushed it into the hyper grace mode, I would have to say for the most part, was Zane Hodges. Now we'll talk more about him later and those that have continued that on since. So I want to do a little history today, and we're going to reach back here a little bit and give you a feeling for where this, because it's kind of confusing. It took me a while to kind of figure this all out. I know this is small. We're going to zoom in on part of this here in a minute. So let me just kind of point out a couple of things here to you. And let me grab I got this little thing I'm checking out here now. So I got this little pointer thing. Well, no, that's the wrong one. Let's not do that. Let's do this one. So I got this little point. Hey, it actually works. Okay. This is for our broadcast people. So I know this is kind of a big chart. It's difficult to see. This chart is out of the book, The Trail of Blood by E.M. Carroll, which I think is a phenomenal book. It's a little book pamphlet. If you don't have it, you should own it and you should read it. The general premise of the book is this in a nutshell. Most people today in denominations in religion will tell you that all religions today came from the Catholic Church. I disagree with that, okay? And it's not that I have an axe to grind with the Catholics. I could care less. They're doctrinally wrong. I could prove that to you from the Scriptures. I could prove it to you any way. I take their own writings and prove them doctrinally wrong. Anybody with an ounce of common sense could look at the Catholic religion and their doctrines and understand there is something greatly wrong with that system. You say, why is the majority of the world Catholic? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. A lot of it has to do just with tradition. People are born Catholic, they live Catholic, they're always Catholic. And the Catholic Church kind of keeps them simple that way. But you could take their own writings and show what's wrong with it. But, so for you to tell me that all religion today came out of the Catholic Church, what? So you mean out of apostasy came truth? You know, I mean, so you're telling me there was never a church apart from the Catholic Church? I disagree with that. And the premise of this book is that there's always been a true line of Christians apart from the Catholic Church. This chart shows a division here. This chart shows a division right here because the Catholic Church divided between what we call Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodox, or Greek Catholic. Today it's known as the Greek Orthodox Church. Okay? And they have continued on as that. In other words, there hasn't been hardly anything spawned out of the Greek Orthodox line or the Greek Catholic line. However, the Roman Catholic line, which we see here, did with the Reformation. And we're going to zoom in on let me move to the next slide because we're going to zoom in on this a little bit. Whoops, went too far. Let's go back. There we go. We're going to zoom in on this area just a little bit because with the Reformation, we have all of these denominations that I consider to be Protestant denominations. I do not believe that Baptists are Protestant. We're not the only ones that did not come out of the Protestant line. For instance, Mennonite, Amish, a lot of these came out of what generally were called Anabaptists. This is the line you see here along the bottom of this chart, down here at the bottom. In this chart it cut off the Anna, but that would say Anabaptist if you were looking at the big chart. Now they went by different names. The Waldensians was one, and different groups depending on where they were located around the world. But these were what I believe to be true Christians. They didn't all agree 100% doctrinally, of course, but they definitely believed that you got saved by faith and faith alone. You only got saved by faith. They did not believe in infant baptism. They only believed in baptizing those who have been saved. All right, so those were two key fundamental beliefs that were common with all of the Anabaptists. And they were generally called Anabaptists. They were called Anabaptists because Anna means or baptize again. So in other words, this is what happened. The Catholic Church insisted that your child be baptized when they were an infant. All right, they were adamant about that because they said that if your child died and it wasn't baptized, it could go to hell or purgatory or whatever. And then it had to be prayed out, bought out, begged out, stolen out, whatever, you know. And that's Catholic theology. So what happens is people would leave the Catholic Church and they would get saved and then they'd go down to the river and get baptized. And they started calling that group of people, those Christians, rebaptizers. They're the Anabaptists. They got it all wrong. And they were persecuted for that greatly. And in fact, at different times, if you didn't baptize your infant, you could be persecuted, even killed. Or if you got baptized later as an adult, you could be persecuted or even killed. All right, so for you to tell me that there's never been a true church, I disagree. And scripturally, I disagree with you. Because Jesus said, this is my church. Upon this rock I'll build my church. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, they will try to tell you that the Catholic Church was the true church and just went bad, and then some smart people got good and came out of it. And I'm sorry, I disagree with that. I don't think it's scripturally correct. I don't think it's historically correct. Okay? So, but we've zoomed in on this area here because I want to show you there have been a lot of religions that have come out of the Protestant movement. And of course, the first being, of course, Luther. And here we see the Lutheran line, the Lutheran Church. And then the Presbyterian line. And the Congregationalists. And then the Church of England. Actually, Congregationalists and the Church of England are very closely associated. Out of the Church of England, we have the Methodists, we have the Holiness Movement, and the Pentecostals, and so on and so forth. I believe Baptists have always been directly descended out of the Anabaptists. Now, in his book, he has these red dots up here indicating the true church, true Christians, because there were some true Christians even amongst this Protestantism. That's why when you study it historically, the Baptists did kind of get caught up in this Protestantism movement. So much to the point where they began to call themselves either Calvinists, which is particular Baptists, or non-Calvinists, which was general Baptists. Okay? So even the Baptists kind of got caught up in this thing as we moved toward the 1800s. Which is why when you study Baptist history, they'll say, well, the Baptist church started here, and the first official Baptist church was here, and blah, blah, blah. And this is also where they get the idea that Baptists have always been Calvinists. Well, that's not true. It's entirely not true. In fact, some of the very first Baptist churches were General Baptists, which means they didn't believe in Calvinism. And they didn't believe in loss of salvation. See, that's another misnomer. They'll try to tell you that the General Baptists believed in loss of salvation. They were Arminian. Well, they were Arminian in the sense that they didn't believe in Calvinism. But the first General Baptists did not believe in loss of salvation. Now, we have Baptists today that are Arminian. We have some Baptist churches today that do believe in loss of salvation. Okay? I know it's confusing. I'm trying not to confuse you, but so just quickly giving you a little bit of Baptist, a little bit of church history. Now, why this is important is because the grace movement actually came out of the Presbyterian church. You say, how in the world could that be? That's the strangest thing in the world. And here is what is really odd. Historically, they came out of the Presbyterian church. Doctrinally, they say they trace their roots to Luther. All right, so let me say that again. Historically, they came out of the Presbyterian church. They came out of right here. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. However, doctrinally, they say they trace their roots to Luther. They say that Luther was the only one that got it right. And Luther wrote what they call the five solas, which is faith only, Bible only, Jesus only, church only, etc. They call it the five solas. It was his main tenets, if you will, main doctrines. And they say that he was the only one that got it right. They say John Knox with the Presbyterians got it wrong because they were Calvinists. And Arminius got it wrong, they were Arminians. And the Church of England got it wrong because, you know, they basically were just Catholic in a different skin, a different coat. And for the most part, that's pretty much true. And the truth of the matter is, despite what they say, Luther, basically the Lutheran Church slid right back into Catholicism. Basically, the Lutheran Church today is just Catholic in a different coat. There was a time that Lutherans preached the gospel, but I got to be honest with you, for the most part today they do not. They're all about the sacraments. They keep a lot of the same sacraments the Catholic Church does. In fact, I've actually talked to, I don't even know what you call them, reverends, who have, what we would use the word pastored, and that's not what they use, but they have pastored Catholic churches and pastored Lutheran churches, both. And they will tell you, well, the Catholics are a little more liturgical, a little more into the sacraments, the Lutherans a little bit less, but, you know, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of these Protestant denominations, for instance, the Methodists, and today it's United Methodists. I know my sister's a United Methodist reverend minister, and the United Methodist is a combination of what used to be the United Brethren, and the Brethren movement at one time was a good movement, preached the gospel. Then it went United Brethren, and they went very liberal. And then there was a faction of the Methodist Church that became very liberal and broke off of main Methodism, and they united because both movements were about to die, and it became United Methodist. And so in order to do that, they basically had to throw out all the doctrine. I've heard this from my sister, okay? She's been through their seminary, she's trained, she's a United Methodist minister, and she told me that their doctrines were radically different, and basically they don't preach doctrine, they preach the liturgy, the liturgical that they send them. In other words, they send them books, I guess, is, for lack of a better word. This is what you preach out of. And it's a lot of do good and be good and love everybody, you know, that sort of thing. Typical liberal doctrine. So a lot of these Protestant movements have swung back toward Catholicism with more emphasis on rituals, sacraments, and the liturgy and these different things than on genuine salvation, which is by faith through grace. Okay? So, the Presbyterian Church, John Knox, broke out, and the Presbyterian Church was, of course, Calvinistic. Where do we find them? Right down here. And out of this Calvinism, we have basically today, we have either Presbyterianism or we have Reformed churches. And I would say the Reformed is really more like a movement, to be honest with you, because you see Reformed Baptists, you can see Reformed non-denominational churches, you can see, I don't know of any Reformed Bible churches, but this idea of Reformed theology kind of transcends. For instance, we have a church here in town called, what's the name of that church? I lost it. I had it here a minute ago. But they like the name Grace. They use the name Grace a lot of times because they believe in the doctrines of grace. Now, we've gone over Calvinism before on a whole nother series, and I don't want to redo that. But what they call the doctrines of grace are not doctrines of grace found in the Bible. And basically, it amounts to the doctrines of Calvinism, all right? So, but out of this Presbyterianism, in the, and there's another thing I need to show you here. Let's go to this next slide because, and we used this slide before when we were talking about Calvinism. So out of this Presbyterian group, there was a man by the name of C.I. Scofield. Many of you have seen the C.I. Scofield Study Bible. C.I. Scofield was a Presbyterian, and in the late 1800s, he began to defect out of Presbyterianism, and he traveled the country. In fact, he went to England quite a bit, and he liked to find doctrinal doctrines that men were putting forth that weren't common, I guess, were not common. One of those doctrines was dispensationalism. The study of dispensationalism, which we've been through that, and we talked about Calvinism. And God's true church has always been premillennial and has always been dispensational. Okay? Now, dispensationalism, though, especially during the Dark Ages, died out. And it was taken over by this post-millennial, amillennial thought, which is the cornerstone, if you will, of Calvinism. All right? So in a sense, what was happening is C.I. Scofield was defecting out of Presbyterianism. He was shedding some of his thoughts on Calvinism and covenant theology, and he adopted the doctrine of dispensationalism. Now, I know that's a lot. I'm throwing a lot out there, and if you say, Pastor, I didn't get all that, it's okay. It's all right. We're just giving you a little history as to how this movement got to where it is, okay? So by the 1900s, he had began to put together a lot of research information, and by 1910, he had begun to write and wrote his study Bible. In other words, the first time that dispensationalism was published and sent around the world was with the C.I. Scofield Study Bible. And in fact, he became a dividing line, if you will, between non-dispensation and dispensations, between dispensational thought and non-dispensational thought. And so C.I. Scofield wrote this study Bible, went around the world, was very popular. They used to have millionaires that would buy these Bibles and give every pastor in America a C.I. Scofield Study Bible. which in those days, in 1910, that was huge. Pastors didn't have libraries like we do today. I mean, I've got 10,000 books in my electronic library. I've got, some of you just helped me move, I've got at least 2,000 physical books. I don't even know. My wife is just very glad that the electronic books are not physical, or it would have taken 2 of those 20-foot trailers to move me. You know, because books are a lot. But, you know, pastors in 1910, they didn't have a lot of books. Quite honestly, they had their Bible and maybe one commentary, maybe a couple of things from Spurgeon if they were very fortunate. So when somebody sends you a study Bible that has commentary and notes for the whole Bible, that was, wow, that was a treasure trove right there. That was huge. And so C.I. Scofield started a movement. And there was a disciple, there was a student of Scofield by the name of Schaeffer. Schaeffer was his last name. I can't think of his first name now. And Schaeffer started a school called Dallas Theological Seminary. And C.I. Scofield died just before they got the school opened up. But if you read the opening comments or when they started the school, it was started in memory and in honor of C.I. Scofield to teach the doctrines of C.I. Scofield. That's why Dallas Theological Seminary was started. And there's a couple of things about this Scofield-Schaeffer group. It was originally led by Scofield. It resolved into the Dallas Theological Seminary. It originally separated from Reformation theology over dispensationalism. All right, so once again, they came from Presbyterianism, but with Dallas Theological Seminary, we now had a school that taught exclusively dispensationalism in opposition to Reformed theology and covenant theology. Okay? I don't want to reteach that whole series. I think we have some of it online. Hopefully you got that. This is another interesting thing about C.I. Scofield. They were the original fundamentalists. The Baptists were not. It's like I've said a lot of times, the Baptists came late to the party. Now that doesn't mean Baptists were not fundamental. Baptists were the plowboys and the backwoods preachers out there, and yeah, they were fundamental, they were conservative. They didn't have Bible colleges. In those days, if you wanted to be a Baptist minister, you went and studied under another Baptist preacher for a few years, and you cleaned toilets and things like that. And, well, in those days, it was outhouses. You know, he'd let you preach now and then. When he felt like the call of God was on you, the church would ordain you, and they'd send you on a mule out somewhere to start a church out in that holler. That's your holler over there, okay? This is my holler. Now that's your holler. Go over there and get a congregation going. And so, quite honestly, the Baptists at that time were not, they didn't have seminaries. They didn't have colleges. Now, the Southern Baptists a little more so, but not the Independent Baptists, okay? So they were not organized. And so the first fundamentalists was the C.I. Scofield-Schaeffer group, to tell you the truth. D.L. Moody was a part of that. Ironsides was a part of that. A lot of these great Bible scholars, by the way, very conservative, definitely fundamental. And so they actually were responsible for writing what was called the Fundamentals of the Faith. It was a big, I think it was 2 books originally, 2 red books. And they sat down and they wrote what they believed to be the fundamentals of the faith, the fundamental doctrines of the Bible. They had another millionaire who owned an oil company who financed that entire project. And once again, they sent those books to every pastor in America. It was something like 5,000, 10,000 copies they printed or something. And I have the original, not an original, but I have it electronically. And it was good. It was good. It was very good. It had a little bit of C.I. Scofield slant to it, but it was definitely good. So they were the original fundamentalists. And because of that, eventually the Baptists came to the party. That was about the 1920s, 1930s, especially with the preaching of, I can't think of their names now, but some of those great preachers of that era, and especially in the South. And so by the 1930s, I'm speaking kind of roughly here, I don't have exact dates, fundamentalism had kind of separated into 2 groups. What we called the Independent Fundamental Churches of America and the Independent Fundamental Baptists. The Independent Fundamental Baptists, because we're independent, we have no organization about us, okay? We're all on our own. The IFCA was very organized. In fact, even today, I don't know why they call themselves independent, because they're not really very independent. These, generally speaking, became Bible churches, Baptist churches. These were mostly centered in, around, and out of Dallas Theological Seminary. These all around the country. You know, every little church that had a little Bible college, and nowadays we have some bigger, of course, independent Baptist Bible colleges, and we've had some big ones over the years. Hiles, for instance, and Lee Robertson there at Tennessee Temple, and even the BBF movement there out of Springfield, and then out on the West Coast, we used to have was LABC, and then nowadays, but today mainly our biggest colleges would be Hiles, West Coast, Golden State, and then the one in Oklahoma. Oh, forgot the name of it. I'll think of it in a minute. There's another one, I think, up in Indiana, Illinois, somewhere up in there. But anyways, we got about 5 pretty good-sized Baptist, independent fundamental Baptist Bible colleges. They don't all agree on everything, of course. They don't all agree on standards 100%, but their fundamental doctrines are sound and pretty much in agreement. And then we have a whole spattering of small Bible colleges all the way down to what we do right here in this church. This is kind of where independent fundamental Baptists have been different from the Bible churches. Bible churches, they don't generally have in-house Bible colleges, but most of their Bible colleges are small because your Bible churches are kind of small as a general rule. You don't really have big ones. Okay? So, Dallas Theological Seminary, let's talk about them for just a minute. They were started by Schaeffer to teach the principles of C.I. Scofield. One of the original bastions of fundamentalism was Dallas Theological Seminary. A lot of our textbooks that we use, even through Rock of Ages Bible College, come from Dallas Theological Seminary. Of course, it's their old ones, written by men like Ryrie, Schaeffer, Pentecost. I'm trying to think of some Ironsides. There are some others that all came out of Dallas. That era of Dallas Theological Seminary was doctrinally very straight. Now, what I find to be a little unusual about Dallas is even though they came out of 5-point Calvinism, they came out of what we'd call Reformed theology, they still retained certain elements of Calvinism. And it kind of varied a little bit between what guys that would call themselves a 2-point to a 4-point Calvinist. And generally, they called themselves Calvinists. Now, the grace movement that came out of Dallas Theological Seminary began to change that thinking, because the grace movement claims to be centrist. In other words, they're not Calvinists and they're not Arminian. They reject both of those movements entirely and say we are more centrist Bible gospel. The funny thing is that's what I came to the conclusion when I was in Bible college years ago and took a stand against Calvinism then. And you want to know something kind of somewhat comical is when I came to this church, they couldn't figure out who I was or where I was doctrinally, and I couldn't figure out where they were at either. And when they sat down and asked my wife and I questions for 3 hours before they voted us in, one of the very first questions they asked me was, they said, "Are you a Calvinist or Arminian?" Well, I didn't know the answer they were looking for, but I said to them I said, "I'm neither one. I'm not a Calvinist or an Arminian. I think they're both doctrinally wrong, and they're both Protestant Reformation doctrines. I disagree with them." That was the exact answer that a hyper grace guy was looking for. I didn't know that. That's probably the main reason they voted me in, even though in reality I'm just a good old-fashioned middle-of-the-road Baptist. I'm not really hyper grace, okay? But that is an area that we would be very much in agreement with the hyper grace movement, because they reject Calvinism, Arminianism, both. Okay? I think as time goes forward, because of the advancement in Reformed theology, you're going to see a lot more independent fundamental Baptists like me saying, "No, wait a minute, I'm not a Calvinist, and I'm not an Arminian." The problem is when you take those two things away, well, what do we call ourselves? So the new buzzword is becoming centrist. In other words, I'm middle. I'm middle, all right? So it was the original place of the grace movement. And as I mentioned already, this was because of a response by Charles Ryrie to John MacArthur. I don't want to spend a lot of time repeating myself. But because of the grace movement coming out of Dallas, here's what happened. We went from the grace movement to free grace to hyper grace. And the grace movement, of course, was in reaction to John MacArthur's lordship salvation. So let me just finish up today by saying this. Hyper means beyond the normal, out of balance. All right? It is a distortion of the doctrine of grace. It has a heavy emphasis on the judgment seat of Christ. I call it the judgment seat of Christ on steroids. And we'll have to talk more about that as time comes, okay? You may not agree with me on the judgment seat of Christ. Quite frankly, I don't care. I believe what I believe because that's what I believe. But I'm allowing of other people's opinions and views. But this movement, I mean, quite honestly, they have men in this movement that believe that if you aren't a good Christian, you'll stand in judgment and you'll spend 1,000 years in a life like hell during the millennium because you didn't serve God well enough. And I'll actually read you their quotes before we're done. This is another thing I couldn't understand when I came to this church. I was like, what is going on? Because I kept hearing this all the time, you know. Well, I went and handed out tracts, earned a few more rewards, amen, earned some more rewards. And they'd say, so yeah, that person, they left our church, they lost all their rewards. You know, boy, come kingdom time, they're going to be in trouble. And I'm like, what is this all about? All right, so we'll deal with that. We'll talk about that before we're done. They've had some extreme views on dispensationalism. Remember, C.I. Scofield presented basic, what they call today fundamental dispensationalism. And C.I. Scofield also presented what we would call fundamental view on the judgment seat of Christ. And hyper grace goes beyond that. It just pushes everything out of balance to an extreme. And then they've got a bit of a bridge to the past. Because hyper grace kind of reaches back to some of their weird roots as far as even covenant theology. It's really odd. Now, Dallas Theological Seminary today, and I need to address this for a minute so that you don't walk out here thinking, well, pastor seems to be endorsing Dallas Theological Seminary. Absolutely not. I wouldn't send anybody to college there. Dallas Theological Seminary today, first of all, it's very liberal. It's very open-minded. And so because of that, they have a conglomerate of teachers and theological thought at Dallas Theological Seminary. They have everything from hyper grace to five-point Calvinism and everything in between. And it's a hodgepodge. And I've heard it rumored, but I have no evidence for this, that they are actually swinging, a lot of the professors are swinging back in to hardline five-point Calvinism Reformed theology. Now remember, originally they were kind of centered, all right? They swung toward hyper grace thanks to Zane Hodges and those boys. And that was really back in more like the 1970s, I believe. And so they took this hard path toward hyper grace. And you know, life does this. Life kind of has a pendulum thing. You even see it in politics, you know. The Democrats get in, oh no, it's terrible, and they keep pushing their left thing. And so the next time it comes time to vote, guess what? America's pendulum kind of does this thing. We kind of swing past center, a little back more toward Republican. And then if the Republicans are smart, they would work on that center group. And a lot of times they're not. They keep pushing their agenda. So the next time it's time to vote, we do this pendulum thing back. And sometimes the pendulum is closer to the middle. Sometimes it does this extreme stuff. All right, so this is kind of what Dallas has done. And we see this a lot even in churches and in theology. So starting in the 1970s, Zane Hodges and his buddies, they pushed this thing hard toward hyper grace. Okay, but I'm afraid what we're seeing now at Dallas is this pendulum is kind of swinging back. And I think what's going to happen before it's all done is they may become definitely Reformed covenant theology. which would be even more so than they ever were in the past. Okay? So, now, if you were to talk to somebody that was into this hyper grace movement, they first of all would tell you, we did not come out of Presbyterianism. No. They would even tell you, we don't have anything to do with DTS today, Dallas Theological Seminary. They call it DTS for short. We don't have anything to do with DTS. No, 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 no. They would tell you that we believe in the original doctrines of Luther. We trace our lineage to Luther, which is odd. I know. I know. I see Jeremy out there shaking his head going, what? Well, you know what? I used to go home from this church every Wednesday night and Sunday night doing the same thing. What? What is going on? You know. And it took me a while to really wrap my head around it. So tonight, just quickly in recap, let me back up here just a little bit and say this. Now, by the way, I was going to show you, I kind of skipped over it. Where am I at here? Let's get back to here. Like, for instance, this person who wrote this chart has Baptists lumped in here with Protestants. See, I disagree with that. Baptists come out of Anabaptists, but I just threw this chart in to kind of show you that. But what I want you to see is, let's get all the way back to here. And this chart, I don't think we have it on our website, but I want to put it up on our website. The original one in his book was hand-drawn and hand-lettered, and somebody kind of cleaned it up and redid it, and I found this, and I think it's a little better. So, just quickly in recap, Anabaptists, the true line of Christianity, I believe, has always been there. Most of this squabbling, this spatting, this back and forth between grace, hyper grace, and Calvinism and all that, quite honestly, is Protestantism. I reject all of it, to be honest with you. I reject it all. There are parts of it we may agree with. It's like Dallas Theological Seminary. There was a lot of good writings that came out of there, a lot of good textbooks out of the old stuff. Pentecost, anything he wrote is worth reading. Anything Ryrie wrote is worth reading. Balancing the Christian Life by Charles Ryrie, I think is one of the greatest books ever written. And I've read it, I don't even know how many times. It was one of my classes. It was a textbook for one of my classes in Bible college here just last year. And I'd already read it 2 or 3 times before that, but I enjoyed going through it again. And Schaeffer, when I studied for my ordination, Schaeffer's original doctrine, systematic theology, was 6 volumes long. It took up this much space on a shelf. And somewhere I have an original set. You guys helped move it the other day, you just didn't know it. And then I have it electronically. But I read that entire 6-volume set 3 times. I read it through 3 times just to write my doctrinal statement when I was ordained. It's very good. He tends a little bit toward Calvinism, not like Reformed theology or hyper-Calvinism, but it's very, very, very good. So a lot of good stuff out of there, but Baptists have always existed apart from Protestantism. All right, Protestantism. And so a lot of these different factions and movements and things you see going on, quite honestly, it's Protestantism. Be careful you don't let yourself get lumped into Protestantism. We're not Protestants. Even though if you join the military, you have to either be Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. Now you can be Wiccan. Or you can be Muslim. I think they've added Muslim now. I think it's one of those 5. But you can't be a Baptist. Or you could just be a non-believer, I guess. I don't know. I guess you could, none of the above. They let you do none of the above? What's that? Non-denominational Christian? Oh, they got that one too. Okay. You just can't be a Baptist. All right. Does anybody have a question? Quick question? Not yet. Yeah, man's like, not yet. I'm going to have a lot more before we're done. I promise you, you probably will, and we will do our best to answer them. And I don't want you to walk out here thinking, wow, this is really heavy. This is hard to understand. It won't be that hard to understand, I promise you, by the time we're done. I think it's very important that you understand this because this movement is doing a lot of damage. And I stand very much opposed to it. I stand very much opposed to what it's done to the gospel. They have made it virtually impossible for somebody to get saved. And that's why when I came to this church, there was no soul winning. There was no gospel tracts. They didn't have an invitation. They hardly ever preached the gospel. They hadn't baptized anybody that had gotten saved in 5 or 6 years before I got here. They had literally boarded up the baptistry, so they had a place for their projector screen. You know, it was really sad, because that's not what Baptist churches are about, never have been about. And so there's a lot of damage out of this movement, and I think it's important that you know and understand it. Probably two of the most damaging movements we have today is Reformed theology and hyper grace. Of those two, hyper grace is the least talked about and the least understood. All right, well, let's stop broadcast and we will take some prayer requests.